I'm Brian Jones, and this is the Matt Balaker podcast.
Hello, good people out there. Thank you once again for tuning in to the Matt Balaker podcast. It makes me feel so important and purposeful. If you want to get extra credit, like I know you do, please click like, subscribe, and share with someone you haven't spoken with in at least 17 months. It'll bring both of you together. Well, you guys, I obviously love you because today's guest is fantastic. And I'm particularly proud of one tradition we have on the podcast, and that's guests with great hair. And this gentleman today carries that on beautifully. He's a Silicon Valley professional with heartland sensibilities. He went from investment banking to the C-suite of two publicly listed real estate investment trusts. Now he's helping create cleaner energy solutions as a managing partner at Windmill Capital Management. Please join me in welcoming Brian Jones to the program. How you doing, Brian?
Great, Matt. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And you have a pretty eclectic background, Brian. And I want to learn about your kind of early days as a student. I understand you studied agriculture and economics at UC Davis. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah. So UC Davis at the time, and perhaps still, doesn't offer us a business degree, but I was attracted to their agricultural economics program because it offered a lot more finance than just a straight economics degree. I often say that we studied finance, but instead of using widgets, our examples were bushels of corn.
So your examples were real life, and often
precisely. Precisely. And it also, it was really interesting training in that a lot of agriculture has artificial supports. And so there was a lot of study around the artificial markets and a lot more real life examples of how things really work as opposed to pure theoretical economics.
Yeah, you're not just manipulating equations. You're actually learning real life skills. And what were some of these? You called it artificial supports, or can you share with our audience what that means?
Yeah, I mean, it's everything from government incentives to produce milk and cheese and artificial supports that are in agricultural commodity markets like corn, and even as we see today. There's various supports in for industries like oil and gas. Right. Certainly, renewable energy is gaining its moment in the sun as far as government incentives. So it's things like that. Those types of incentives and supports for particular markets that the government thinks are important. Single-family housing, likewise, sure. has a significant amount of government support.
You're rekindling certain memories, Brian. So thank you. I feel like
sorry about that.
No, I studied economics at UCLA, which was about as theoretical and unpractical as it gets. It was basically a math major, which is good and bad. But one thing I remember learning, and this was a long time ago, so please kind of correct me if I'm saying it wrong, was about the, I think it's sugar subsidies. I want to call it the 1970s or 1980s in America, where
sure.
it was kind of a case study of concentrated benefit and diversified costs, where American sugar farmers would essentially, American farmers would sell sugar to government entities, and then in exchange, the government would not put it on the market. So it would create a sort of scarcity. So in a sense, sometimes they'd be paid to produce something that wasn't sold, or I think in other instances, they were paid not to produce. What do you remember about this, and how am I butchering it?
Oh no, you're absolutely right. Sometimes the farming business is extremely difficult, and I don't think that farmers get enough credit for the entrepreneurism that's required to be in that business, and in particular family farms that pass from generation to generation. There's a lot of fortitude, and a lot of my classmates were from farm families in the Central Valley, and I give a lot of credit. So it's, you have a lot of factors, short and long term, that impact supply and demand for agricultural commodities and other commodities, for that matter. And but it's not necessarily that easy for farmers to pivot what it is that they're growing. Perhaps more in the case of row crops, for example. But if you look at trees, fruit trees, nut trees, if you have a dairy farm, it's not easy to pivot to producing something else. So and then you have external factors like weather and other elements that are changing the annual supply. And so in order to balance those markets a little bit better, the government steps in. And then, of course, there's the political aspect to all of that as well.
What? No. It's all purely what's best for the maximum number of people. I how dare you, Brian Jones?
You're right. Right.
So you're learning valuable skills at UC Davis, and I'm curious, was farming or agriculture in your family, or did you have any kind of personal interest?
No, my uncle had a connection to the wine business. Nice. I was in the wine business with a large winery for his entire professional career, but it really, my ambition was to move to San Francisco and not really work in agriculture, but it like things do, they come full circle. So
there aren't many row crops at Market Street in San Francisco, but they do come full circle. So I want to learn about that. So you get out of school, and what was your first kind of quote unquote real job? My first real job, professional job, I was an associate in the real estate tax group at Coopers and Lybrand. So I took that practical economics/finance degree and did with it one of the most practical things that you can do, and that is planning for tax structures and preparation of tax returns, again, primarily for real estate companies. The kids out there, sometimes people get a positive return on their education investment. Brian
That's right.
Here is a case in point on that. So, I understand you have a master's in taxation. Is that correct?
I do. I got my master's in tax from Golden Gate University while I was working full time at Coopers. Just chipped away at one class every semester until I got my degree. But sometimes it was a necessary distraction from things like busy season, and sometimes it was a bit more of a chore. But it just sticking with it and staying in that learning mentality, I think is important. However it manifests itself, throughout one's career.
Yeah, that's a good lesson. You're working, but then you're also going to school at night. You're broadening your skill set. And, not everyone who listens to this program, Brian, has a master's in taxation. So for them, you're a generous guy. What are some fundamentals of call it tax policies for companies, or just people who don't know a lot? Like what are some kind of central tenets that you think are important for them to understand?
Well, I think there's the tenets around tax are similar to the tenets around accounting in general, and I in addition to my master's in tax, I also got my CPA license, and it's currently inactive, but I'm a California CPA, and so there's they're very similar principles between accounting principles, general accounting principles, and what you see in taxes as far as making sure that things balance at the end of the day. I mean, that's really what it comes down to is how things balance. But I was one of the big things about taxes to me was looking at a company. You can understand a lot from how a company operates by looking at their tax return, surprisingly, and so you sort of start with the end, but you can go through and really understand how a company makes money, what the potential risks of that company are, and potential exposures and things like that. And I think that that training also was instrumental as I've gone through my career. Just as what we do now, we spend a lot of time trying to understand business models and how people make money, and that sort of training really started in my first years at Coopers.
That makes sense. My first job out of college, I would do due diligence on sometimes private, often public companies, and I went to a conference, and the gentleman said, try to look at their tax returns because they rarely BS the IRS. And
right.
I think it's like there's so much fluff out there, in forecasts and in slide decks. But if you can actually see, all right, what did they spend money on? What did they make? And they're like liable, to the government for this. So if you can get tax returns, people look at those. So you're working on taxes at Coopers. Then you moved to investment banking. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, so one of the first things that I was also an English major, and one of the first projects that I
so talented.
Yes. I read a lot of Shakespeare for what that's worth. But one of the first projects that I worked on for the partner who ran the tax group at the time was a treatise that he wrote for Coopers called REITs, a vehicle for the 90s. And so this was early 1990s.
That sounds so Shakespearean, but please continue.
It was not very Shakespearean, but it really was a fabulous prediction of the growth that we've seen over the last 30 years in the real estate investment trust market. This was at a time when REITs are a child of the 50s, but really got their day after the 86 Tax Act, when a lot of the changes that were enacted had a huge negative impact on the real estate syndication market. And so investors and their bankers were looking for another way to package real estate as an investment. And so REITs emerged and have that market is, I don't know how many multiples, 100 times the size that it was in the early 1990s. And so I was at the forefront of that, working first on the tax side, but then after working on a number of IPOs for real estate companies into publicly traded REITs, I had the opportunity to pivot into investment banking, and so instead of just seeing the tax disclosures in the prospectus, I got to see the whole thing. And
you got to see how the sausage was made, so to speak.
Yes. The whole sausage, as it were, the whole plate. And so that was exciting and challenging, and really broadened the things that I was looking at and the work that I was doing.
So where were you when you became an investment banker? Like what year was this, and what city?
So this is 1997 in San Francisco.
And you were doing REITs.
And I was doing REITs, yes.
So this was we had our first guest, Carol Roth, I think she was at Robertson Stevens. I could be very wrong on that, but she was started as investment banker around 97 in San Francisco, and I don't think she was as involved in .coms as others. But for listeners out there, this was I guess eBay would kind of just, I don't know if it just came public, but this is pets.com. Yahoo was big, web crawler. Right. So in a sense, you're at the epicenter for this initial, call it Internet 1.0, but you're doing real estate deals.
Right.
Talk to us about that.
There was definitely some deal envy going on, not only for the volume of things that were happening in the Bay Area at that time, but some of the names that you mentioned. I could throw out some names of company IPOs that we worked on, and it's unlikely that you've ever heard of them. So, as compared to, as you said, eBay and Yahoo. So that definitely a little bit of deal envy. But I worked for a minute in tech, and even today, or I guess more so today, there's a big intersection now between real estate and technology. Prop tech in general is a hot topic, and things change and things evolve. There's confluence in everything ultimately. There were definitely times when I wish we were a little bit busier, and you look down the hall at what some of the other folks are working on, and real estate has had its moments. I was working at Morgan Stanley in 2007, 2008, when there was a huge M&A boom in real estate, and we were the end. At that point, we were the envy of everybody else.
Oh, so, yeah, I mean that tech bubble burst pretty loudly.
Yes.
Call it early 2000s, and so I mean, I'm noticing a common theme with your career, Brian. It's food and shelter, and if you're involved in those things, I think you'll have some longevity, and you're evidence of that. And I remember I started my career in the early 2000s, and I think it's refreshing, in a sense that right now, some of the best, I guess, paying opportunities they're in agriculture, they're in energy, they're in real estate. It's not always about like the fastest app or a tech fad. I mean, it's old saying, what's old is new again. So I want to learn more about moving from, so you were in investment banking for quite a long time. And in investment banking, there's a lot of people kind of use it. There may be an associate, they'll stay there a few years, and in the long hours and bad suits get the best of them, and they bolt. But you had a pretty long career in investment banking, but then you shifted again just to focus more on energy. Can you talk to us about that, please?
Yeah. So I made sort of a half step, an intermediate step from Wall Street investment banking, and I joined what really was an asset management platform focused on primarily on real estate, but other income producing types of investments, and in fund form, primarily working with retail investors, mom and pop investors. So part of my role there was working on what are the investment themes that or what investment themes make sense for this cohort of investors that are looking for safety over risk, and current income over potential future capital gains, and those types of things, real meat and potatoes type investments. And we looked at the energy sector, of course, which has traditionally been one that has been a strong generator of cash flow, and then we looked specifically at renewable energy and how those assets might be owned, by investors for the purpose of producing, current cash flow. and potentially tax protected cash flow or inflation protected cash flow. And that's when I really started studying the renewable energy business. And so when I left that platform, I had been commuting to New York every week from San Francisco for 6 years. And so when I decided I couldn't do that travel anymore, I formed Windmill Capital, and our focus at that time was financing commercial scale renewable energy projects.
So I love how, and I sympathize with you on this. You're sick of traveling, so you're like, I'm just going to start something. Don't have to travel as much. I think that's pretty cool.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was and continues to be a very strong investment thesis around renewable energy, and what I saw at that time was, especially in the commercial space, where not residential rooftop solar and not the utility scale types of projects, but again, that meat and potatoes, steady type of investment that is extremely durable. These assets are 30, 40, 50-year duration assets, can generate cash flow, predictable cash flow. And I saw a lot of appeal for those types of investments for a broad range of investors. But, the commercial, at the time, particularly, 6 years ago, the commercial renewable energy space was not particularly investable for most investors.
Why is that, or why was that?
Well, the deals are difficult to access. They're somewhat difficult to underwrite. There's the deal structures can be complicated. Certain of the assets have receive some sort of government incentives, and so it is and in particular the lending environment at that time, the bank lending environment was still maturing. So initial transactions that we worked on were sometimes overly complicated by the fact that the markets hadn't yet matured. But at the same time, we saw that there was huge potential for these types of assets, and having experienced the REIT boom of the early 90s, I saw some significant parallels, and the real and it remains to be seen exactly how it evolves, but these assets in large portfolios are appropriate for virtually any portfolio, particularly income-oriented portfolios. And but as I said, particularly they're really only investable for private in a private form. Eventually, the market is going to evolve, and these assets are going to be suitable for ownership in a public form, whether it's a REIT type of vehicle or a master limited partnership, which is how traditional oil and gas assets are owned by the public. The renewable energy sector is going to go in that direction, and so that has been one of our guiding lights since the beginning, is that there is going to be what we call democratization of the ownership of these types of assets. And so we think that that's very exciting, in addition to all the other developments we've seen in the space over the last 6 years.
Oh, it is very exciting. And you talked about democratization of ownership of assets. I mean, in a nutshell, that's what public markets are. Yeah, I mean, it's
Yes, precisely.
it's pretty amazing to think that, for $10, $20, an average person can participate in the upside of so many companies. And it takes people like you, it takes entrepreneurs, and it usually starts off in a concentrated format, like you were talking about REITs earlier. Initially, they're probably available to just a wealthy few, and then more people come on board, and platforms are built, and transaction costs are lowered, and more people get to participate in it. I think that's a beautiful thing. But I want to rewind just a little bit, because you sharpened your pencil and you learned more about energy, renewable energy. I think, one, that's commendable, but two, to people out there, and by people out there I mean me, what are some of the most, I guess, misunderstood concepts about energy today?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One is that if we look at energy markets broadly, they the existing system that we have for the production and distribution of power and heat, whether that's heat through electricity or delivery of natural gas, what have you. The system that we have, if we were to build it today, wouldn't look anything like the system that we have, right? The notion of these centralized energy production power plants with a distribution network that relies on cables and poles and things like that is not something that we would build today. So when we look at telecommunications, for example, new markets, third world countries, for example, aren't putting up hardline phone communications, right? They're using satellites
have replaced the ugly phone lines, and
precisely, and so that's nothing more than a distributed network versus the centralized network that we see, and so again, if we were to look at energy today, how has it changed? It's changed in that the assets that produce the power can be scaled down so that they can be put on site at a factory or a data center or an apartment building or a hotel, and economically produce the power that's needed to run that facility or that operation. And you eliminate the transmission loss, you eliminate the cost of the transmission lines, all that infrastructure itself, and you also you can't completely eliminate, but you reduce the potential and the cost of outages, because if the wind's blowing and a tree goes down and it drops a line, then you lose power. You don't have that situation when you have on-site power. So that's the
so it sounds like a decentralization of power sources.
It's decentralized. I mean, the way that we see it is that these commercial scale on-site energy centers, these assets deliver power that's cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable. And I mean, what else could a customer want, right?
Customers want hair like yours, but not all of them are going to get that. But cleaner, cheaper, more reliable. That's
cleaner,
that's
cheaper, more reliable. That's a good second place, right?
It's distant, but it's a good second place. Brian.
Yeah. So that's the trade-off today, and really the only thing that stands in the way is of an energy future that sees cleaner, cheaper, more reliable on-site energy generation is capital, right? Capital is the biggest obstacle, and so part of our business is making that capital less of an obstacle.
And how's that done?
So it's talking to investors about again, what is the thesis behind ownership of these assets? Why are they attractive to own? Educating investors about what the economics are, because it's although they're similar to a lot of other types of investments, that's like everything. It's got its own jargon and metrics and megawatts and kilowatts and BTUs and all that stuff, right? So it's got its own jargon.
Jargon.
Yeah. So, but it's not. At the end of the day, it's not complicated, and so helping investors understand how this works, what the opportunity is, what the economics are, and I think that there's these are the types of projects that we look at utilize energy technologies that are well proven. A lot of them are 40, 50, 60, 100 years old.
Okay.
So it's not, we're not out on the bleeding edge trying to make the 20 years from now type of energy center. We're looking at technologies that can be deployed and utilized today and for the next 30 to 40 years. So
very cool. And what are some of these technologies, Brian?
They range, from a renewable. We say clean and renewable because not all of these technologies are 100% renewable, but they are all, as I said, cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable than the power that we're getting, from the utilities. So, we look, of course, at solar and wind. We also look at bioenergy, which is the conversion of some sort of a bio feedstock into
cellulose fiber. I know is a common one.
Yeah, but I mean, it could range anywhere from some sort of a fiber to animal and food waste to municipal waste, recycled tires, plastic. There's a whole range of waste products that can be converted into fuel and or energy.
So you're taking a byproduct and putting it to a beneficial use.
Correct. And so we're helping to create at least partially circular economies from the reuse of waste materials, and that can be very exciting. Some of the innovations there are super compelling and really interesting to learn about.
So there's a lot of compelling innovations, and that brings up a question I'm curious about. Like, you have opportunities to see some really fascinating projects, but you also have to balance it against kind of your responsibility to earn a return. How does that work? Talk us through that.
Yeah. So we're not a venture investor. The assets that we own have to create power reliably and have proven the ability to do so over time with predictable costs and importantly, a long-term agreement with somebody to purchase that power. So, we're looking for long-term, what's called an offtake agreement, power purchase agreement for somebody to buy the power that we're creating, and then technologies that are predictable in the amount of energy that they're going to produce and the costs of operating and maintaining that project over the long term.
So it's not just what you think is the coolest at the moment.
I mean, we keep an eye on that sort of thing just because we need to be aware of how those technologies change, are going to change the market. But we're very comfortable with the assets that we own, being in service, expecting them to be in service, certainly for long after I'm gone. And I think that sort of long-term outlook is consistent with the overall investment approaches that a lot of our limited partners take. And so that's a consistent approach from both sides.
So
just to close it out,
the
other types of energy production we look at are cogeneration, which is on-site utilizing a fuel to produce electricity and then taking the heat byproduct and using that for a separate purpose. That could be a manufacturing purpose, or it could be domestic heat, domestic hot water, things like that. And then geothermal. Geothermal energy has been around for years and years and years, but completely underutilized. And that's actually brings up another point, which is that a lot of these technologies have been proven in other markets, and in particular, Europe is far, decades potentially in front of the U.S. for deployment of renewable energy technologies that just have not caught on for whatever reason in the U.S. But they've been proven effective, and they're becoming less and less expensive as well, because as more of these technologies are deployed, more of them of these assets are being produced. The production costs come down with economies of scale, and at the same time, we're also seeing overall costs of energy rising. Whether that's costs in commodity fuel markets because of weather or because of geopolitical disruptions like what we're seeing in Russia, but also just general increases in costs at the utility level because they're replacing old power plants, or they're maintaining and upgrading the transmission network. The excess additional capital costs that they're incurring. So we're seeing the need and demand for electricity to increasing. We're seeing the costs of that power from the utilities going up, and at the same time, the cost of the equipment to produce that energy on site is coming down. So all of those dynamics are positive for our investment thesis, and making investments that again are gonna be producing power for the next 20 to 40 years.
So it's not just power today; it's power decades from now. And because I have your ear, Brian, I'm curious. I live in California. It seems like when it gets windy, my power's out. When it's hot, my power's out. Not all the time, but when it's cold, like it is now, I haven't had a power outage in a few weeks, so I'm grateful for that. I'm in this like hotbed of technological advancement, but in some ways, it feels like I'm in the stone ages of power utilization. What do you think is contributing to these, in my opinion, too common power outages?
Well, California has its own specific issues. We've seen a lot of impact from wildfires that certainly have not only destroyed communities, but also made the utilities a lot more conservative when it comes to preemptively shutting down the power before there's a problem, and that usually comes because you've got wind and high temperatures. But as you said, it could be it's not just California. It's if you're in Texas. My son is a freshman at university in Texas, and they've had power outages related from the time that he started in the fall. They've had power outages related to not at his university, but just in the community where he is, related to the heat, related to rain. And now it's been freezing, and so they've got power outages related to deep freeze. So all of those things contribute to this increasingly unstable distribution network, and it promotes the particularly in the commercial space, the appeal of on-site energy production.
Cool. So we are wrapping up, but I want to get your take, Brian, on the future of energy. Like what do you see happening that excites you?
Yeah, there's no question that the future of energy is in electrification. We're seeing electrification in transportation, not just passenger transportation, but more and more in commercial transportation. We're seeing electrification in appliances, in machinery, and all of that and of course, as more things are digitized as well, we're seeing greater demand for electrical power. And so there's no question that that electrification is going to drive on the demand side, but electrification is somewhat self-fulfilling, because you have, the more electric cars you have, the more capacity you need for charging stations and battery storage and other renewable sources that complement that zero pollution vehicle, but likewise, the more battery technology that you have, and the more charging stations that you have, the greater the network of electric vehicles you can have. And so the electrification is self-fulfilling and sort of creates its own perpetual growth for demand for power. But I don't think you can have a discussion about energy today without also looking at climate change and the impact, the potential impact that we're going to see from climate change, and that's all driven by not converting or ceasing the use of fossil fuels, and creating carbon emissions that are, that the last 8 years have been collectively the hottest on record since the beginning of record keeping in the 1800s. So, there's no question that is that's being driven by CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. And the impacts of climate change are inescapable. Every single person on the planet is going to be affected by climate change, and it affects so many different things. Just taking the big ones and sort of touches back a little bit on the things we've talked about in my career. It affects food production. It affects availability and supply and accessibility of water for humans and agricultural needs. It affects where people can live. Rising, we've got melting glaciers and rising oceans, and there's going to be substantial displacement of people. The world could see the greatest mass migration ever, as a result of climate change. And all of these things are going to contribute to greater political and socio instability. And in particular, the climate change disproportionately affects low-income communities and low-income countries. And so you've got an amplified socioeconomic impact from climate change as well. The best weapon we have against climate change is conversion to renewable energy sources, using less fossil fuel and using more renewable energy. And whether we do that through certainly conversion, but also greater efficiencies and things like that, they all contribute to a reduction in the amount of fossil fuels and preventing, that cataclysmic climate change. And so that I think is the future of energy. And it's just a matter of, as we say, scale drives impact.
Scale drives impact. Well, you said a lot of important stuff, and we all want to avoid calamities. I don't know if this can be answered quickly, but as best you can, Brian. In America, why isn't nuclear more utilized? Because it's something that seems like at scale it has a lot of green benefits. I mean, obviously there's risk too, but what say you?
Yeah, I am a proponent of nuclear. The problems, the issues with nuclear around safety, I think, are somewhat exaggerated. The problem that we have with nuclear is that it takes decades to develop utility scale nuclear plants. Mm-hmm. Whereas we could develop a 200 megawatt utility scale solar farm in 2 years. The time that we need to deploy nuclear is much longer, and so it doesn't provide the immediate response that we need. And listen, it's small scale fission or fusion. That's gotten some press recently. I think it's fantastic, but again, it's theoretical. And right. And we're looking. We really need to solve the climate crisis. We need to act today. We need to use the technologies that we have today. And thankfully, the technologies that we have today can help avert a climate crisis, a true climate crisis. But we need to deploy those technologies at scale.
Okay. Well, thank you. And we're concluding. But what are you most optimistic about, Brian, when it comes to the future of energy?
I think there's two pieces really. One is certainly the innovation around energy is absolutely impressive, and there's some groups that both on the funding side as well as on the experimental side are doing some fantastic, groundbreaking work in new energy technologies. We also say, in addition to scale drives impact, we also say that innovation is nothing without implementation. And so that implementation means greater awareness around opportunities, and I think that there is certainly, from a private investor standpoint, huge interest in impact investing, for example, as a means to both, produce an economic return as well as create a positive, environmental and social impact. And so, and that leads to the other piece that's incredibly encouraging is the willingness to and eagerness even to learn more about what we can do to avert climate catastrophe and because renewable energy is a direct has a direct relationship to that climate challenge. And so the things that we're seeing on a global scale, more and more capital and as well as just attention, brain space, mind share around the opportunities in renewables have been incredibly impressive, and that gets driven by a number of different factors, not the least of which is that our government, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, really set a very high global standard for economic support for deployment of renewable energy. And so, that attention and commitment is incredibly important and impressive.
Nice. So I appreciate that. And where can people out there learn more about you, Windmill? How can they get in touch if they've got millions and billions of dollars they want to put to use? Where do we send them?
Yes, Windmill capitalmanagement.com. I know it's a mouthful. I'll say it again. Windmill capitalmanagement.com. And you can reach us there and learn more about what we do and why.
And we'll be sure to include links to that as well on the description for this show. So, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Matt.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Matt Balaker podcast. To learn more, please check out mattbalaker.com and encourage your friends to like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate it.